No! Jessica cried in dismay as she wrangled her keys from the pocket of her fashionably too-tight jeans. An apple tumbled out of the paper grocery bag she was struggling to balance on her hip and rolled away down the hallway. It came to rest on the welcome mat of her worst neighbor, a middle-aged man who seemed capable of detecting the tiniest noise, then promptly complaining about it. In fact, since she moved into the apartment 6 months ago, leaving behind the dorm room she and Charlie had shared, he had come to her door 3 times to complain about her radio. Twice it had not even been on. Mostly he just glared at her whenever they passed in the hall. Jessica didn't really mind the hostility. It was a little like being back home, in New York. She left the apple where it was. Having managed to get the door open, Jessica dropped the bags on the kitchen counter and looked around the room with a quiet satisfaction. The apartment wasn't very fancy, but it was hers. When she first moved in, she had gone on a cleaning rampage, scouring out the baked-in dirt that must have been lining the baseboards. She had gone on a cleaning rampage, scouring out the baked-in dirt that must have been lining the baseboards since the building went up some 50 years ago. It had taken almost 2 weeks of nothing but scrubbing between classes and homework, and she went to bed every night with sore arms, as though she'd done nothing but weight training. But now the apartment was clean enough for Jessica, albeit just barely, which was no small bar to clean. She began taking things out of the grocery bags, lining everything up on the counter, before putting each item away. Peanut butter, bread, milk, bananas, she muttered to herself, then fell silent. Something is wrong. She looked around the room carefully, but there was no one there, and everything seemed to be where she'd last left it. She returned to the grocery bags. As she closed the refrigerator door, the hair at the back of her neck prickled. Jessica whirled around, as though expecting to catch a burglar in the act, her heart jolting with adrenaline, but the room was still. Just to be sure, she went to check the door. It was locked, as expected. She stood in silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of her apartment complex, the hum of an air conditioning unit outside, a leaf blower across the street, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She stepped carefully back to the counter and finished putting away the groceries, then headed toward her bedroom. She turned the corner to the hallway and screamed. A figure stood in the dark, blocking the way. "Jessica?" said a familiar voice, and Jessica reached hastily for the light switch. The light flickered on slowly. It was Charlie. "Did I scare you?" Charlie said uncertainly. "Sorry. The door was unlocked. I should have waited outside," she added, looking down at her shoes. "I just figured, since we used to be roomies anyway." "Charlie! You scared me to death!" Jessica said in a mock, scolding tone. "What are you doing here?" "I told you I'm having dinner with John," Charlie said, and Jessica nodded. "Could I borrow something to wear? Maybe you could help me pick something out?" Charlie looked hesitant, like she was asking an immense favor, and Jessica gave her a puzzled frown. "Yeah, sure, of course." Jessica tried to calm herself. "But, Charlie, it's not like you need my help choosing an outfit these days." Jessica gestured at Charlie's clothing. She was wearing her habitual combat boots, or a more elegant version of them, but she had paired them with a medium-length black skirt and a dark red, scoop-necked blouse. Charlie shrugged and shifted her feet. "I just think he might like me better if you help me pick an outfit, instead of me dressing myself, you know? John doesn't seem to like my new look." "Well, Charlie..." Jessica stopped, choosing her words carefully. "It won't do either of you any good to pretend nothing has happened," she said firmly. "Where would you have on? You look great." "You think so?" Charlie said, looking doubtful. "Yeah," Jessica said. She brushed past Charlie to go into her room, stepping cautiously past her, and Charlie followed, pausing in the doorway like a vampire waiting for an invitation. Jessica looked at Charlie and was suddenly set at ease, as if their friendship had never been interrupted. Jessica grinned. So, I mean, are you nervous? She asked, going to her dresser for her hairbrush, and Charlie came in and sat down on the bed. I feel like I have to prove something to him, but I'm not sure what, she said, tracing the flower design on Jessica's bedspread. You were right, by the way. Jessica turned around, brushing her hair absently. He wants to see you tonight. I think that's a great start, she offered. Just let him spend some time with you. He's been through a lot. Remember, from his perspective, he saw you die, right in front of his eyes. Charlie laughed, a soft, forced sound, then was silent. I'm just worried about him, and I can't even help him because... She broke off. Jessica, do you remember him telling me something important that night? Something in her tone changed. It was subtle, just a hint of strain. Jessica kept her expression neutral, pretending not to notice. Something important? Jessica asked. Something that I would remember. Should remember. She kept her eyes on the bedspread, still tracing the pattern like she was trying to memorize it. Jessica hesitated. She could still see it all, as vivid as the present, though it gave her a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Charlie was trapped in the twisted, broken Freddy suit, with just her arm free. John was holding her hand. Jessica shuddered. That terrible, singular, crunching sound echoed in her head. Jessica? Charlie asked, and Jessica nodded briskly. Sorry, she cleared her throat. I don't know. You and John were alone for a few minutes. I'm not sure what he said. Why? I think it's important to him that I remember, Charlie said, back to tracing the bedspread. Jessica watched her for a short moment, suddenly ill at ease in her own bedroom. As if sensing it, Charlie stood and met her eyes. Thanks, Jessica, she said. Sorry again for breaking in. I mean, I didn't break in. The door was unlocked. But you know what I mean. No problem. Just announce yourself sooner next time? Jessica smiled, feeling a rush of warmth from her friend. She hugged Charlie goodbye at the door. Charlie walked a few steps and picked the apple up off the ground, then handed it back to Jessica. I think this belongs to you, Charlie smiled, then turned to walk away. When she had closed the door, Jessica sighed. The anxiety that had risen while Charlie was in her room was not abated. She leaned back against the door, replaying what had just happened. Why would John want Charlie to remember the last thing he said to her? She tossed the apple a few inches into the air, then let it fall back into her hands. He's testing her, Jessica said to the empty apartment. Outside Jessica's building, Charlie stopped in the parking lot, frustrated. What did he say that was so important? She walked across the baked pavement to her car. Charlie climbed into her car, slamming the door shut with more force than she needed to. She stared petulantly at the steering wheel. They're lying to me, she thought. I feel like a little kid, with all the grown-ups keeping secrets from me, deciding for me what I should and shouldn't know. She glanced at her watch. The clock in the car was either an hour ahead or an hour behind. She could never remember which. She had about 20 minutes before she had to meet John. I can't show up early, she said plainly. Then he really won't believe it's me. Trying to shrug off her bad mood, Charlie put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot. When she got to the restaurant, she could see John through the window, seated at the same table they had sat at last time, all the way in the back. He was staring into space, as if he weren't deep in thought, or completely zoned out. She followed the hostess to his table, and it was only when she was standing right beside him that he seemed to realize she was there. When he did, he stood hastily. Charlie started to move toward him. but he sat back down, and she quickly sidestepped and did the same. "Hi," she said with an awkward smile. "Hi, Charlie," he said quietly, then grinned suddenly. "You're dressed a lot nicer than the last time we were here." "It probably just seems that way because I'm not covered in dirt and blood this time," Charlie said lightly. "Right," he laughed, but there was a quick instant of appraisal in his eyes. That was a test. The thought sent something cold through the pit of her stomach. She had known it would happen, but knowing did not make it easier to have his eyes, usually so warm, look at her with calculation. "What was the movie we saw?" John asked, seeming to fumble at an answer. "Last time I visited, we went to that theater down the street, didn't we? It's on the tip of my tongue." "Zombies versus zombies," Charlie said. "Right. I knew it was about zombies," John said thoughtfully. "So, what have you been doing since then?" Charlie asked, attempting to shift the topic. "Are you still doing construction work?" "Yeah," John said, then cast his eyes down at the table. "Actually, maybe not. I just got fired." "Oh," Charlie said. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "Yeah, I mean, it was my fault. I showed up late and there was some other stuff, but I really liked that job. Well, it was a job, at least." "There have to be other building sites," Charlie said. "Yeah, I guess." He looked at her, searchingly, and she looked back, trying not to shrink under scrutiny. "Believe me," she pleaded silently. "What will it take for you to believe me?" "I've missed this," she said instead. He nodded, his eyes softening for a moment. "Me too," he said quietly, though she knew it was only half true. "You know, I didn't leave because of it. It wasn't because of you," Charlie said. "I'm sorry if it seemed like it was. I just had to get away from everything and everyone. Are you folks ready to order?" the waitress asked brightly. John straightened his posture and cleared his throat. Charlie looked down at the menu, glad of the interruption, but the pictures of food looked strange, as if she had heard food described, but never seen any. "Miss?" The waitress was looking at her expectantly. "I'll have the same," Charlie said quickly, and shut the menu. The young woman frowned confusedly. "Oh, okay. I guess I should order then." John laughed. "Anything will be fine," Charlie said patiently. "I'm sorry. I'll be right back." She got up from the table hastily and headed for the bathroom, leaving John to take care of things. Walking into the bathroom, she was struck with a jarring sense of déjà vu. "I've been here before. Trapped in a box. I was trapped in a box." Charlie slammed the door shut and locked it. "I'm not trapped." She ran her fingers through her hair, though it didn't really need adjusting, and washed her hands. She was just killing time, stealing a moment away from John's scrutiny. Every time he gave her that level, untrusting look, she felt exposed. "I am Charlie," she said to her reflection, smoothing down her hair again nervously. "I don't have to convince John that I'm me." The words sounded thin in the small room. Who else would I be? Charlie washed her hands again, straightened her shoulders, and went back out into the dining room. She sat down and put her paper napkin in her lap, then looked John squarely in the eye. "I still don't remember," she said abruptly, seized by an obstinate recklessness. John raised his eyebrows. "What?" "I don't remember what you said to me that night. I know it's important to you. I know maybe it's why you think what you think about me. But I just don't remember. I can't change that." "Okay." He slid his hands off the edge of the table and let them rest in his lap. I know that. A lot happened that night. I know. He sighed for a moment, but then smiled almost reassuringly. Charlie bit her lip. If it's that important, why can't you just tell me? She asked gently. Instantly, she could see that it was the wrong thing to say. John's features hardened. He drew back from the table slightly. She looked down at the napkin in her lap. She had been shredding the corner of it without noticing. Never mind, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, letting several long minutes pass. Forget I said anything. She looked up, but John didn't respond. Excuse me for just a minute. I'll be right back. He got up and left the table. She stared at his empty chair. The waitress approached and cleared her throat. Charlie heard her, but did not move. She wasn't sure she could move. This is going horribly. Maybe I'll just sit here forever. I'll be a statue of myself, a monument to Charlie that was, Charlie that will never be again. Miss? The waitress sounded concerned, and it was enough for Charlie to, with Herculean effort, turn her head. Is everything all right, miss? The waitress asked, and it took Charlie another long moment to comprehend the question. Yes, she said at last. Could I have another napkin? She held up the first, half shredded, as evidence of her need, and the waitress went away. Charlie turned back to John's empty chair. John slid back into view and sat down, breaking the line of her vacant stare. Everything okay? He asked. She nodded. The waitress is getting me another napkin. Charlie gestured vaguely in the direction the waitress had gone. Right. He opened his mouth to go on, but before he could speak, the waitress returned, carrying Charlie's napkin, along with their food. They were both silent as she placed it in front of them, and John smiled at her. Thanks, he said. Charlie stared at her plate. It was some kind of pasta. She took her fork carefully, but didn't start to eat. Can I ask you something? John finally said, and she nodded eagerly, setting the fork back down. He took a deep breath. That night. How did you survive? There was so much blood. He stopped, at a loss for words. Charlie looked at him, at the familiar face that had somehow turned against her. She had been trying to piece together a story for him, but now she just spoke. I don't know, she said. There's time missing. When I try to think about it, my mind flinches away. Like it's hit something sharp. The distance in John's eyes faded a little as she spoke. I'd been in a suit before, she went on. I think I must have figured out how to get away somehow. Or at least, how to position myself. She looked anxiously at him, and his gaze sharpened. I still don't understand. How did you manage to get away? Undamaged. He looked her up and down again, seeming to examine her. Charlie's breath caught in her throat, and she turned away from him, staring fixedly out the window at the parking lot. I didn't, she said tightly. John didn't answer, searching Charlie's half-turned face for a spark of something he could recognize, or not recognize. She was saying all the right things in all the right ways, and her hints, more than hints, at the unshakable trauma she had gone through that night made his stomach clench. As she gazed off into the middle distance, her jaw was clenched. She looked like she was fighting something off, and John was seized with the sudden urge to go to her, to hold out his hand and offer his help. Instead, he picked up his fork and began to eat, looking down at his plate instead of at her. She knows what I'm doing, he thought, chewing grimly. She's giving me the right answers. Some detective I've turned out to be. John took another bite and stole a glance at her. She was still looking off at the parking lot. He swallowed and cleared his throat. Before he could speak, Charlie turned back to him. After that night, I had to get away, she said. Her voice was hoarse, and her face was strained, her features seeming harsher than before. I had to leave everything behind, John. Everything. My whole life has been haunted by what happened here. In the last couple of years. Even before that, too. It's just been my whole life. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, blinking rapidly like she was holding back tears. I wanted to be somebody different. I had to, or I'd go insane. I know it's cliche to think you can change your life if you change your hair and your clothes. She gave an ironic half smile and flipped her long hair over her shoulder. But I couldn't be your Charlie forever. That naive little girl, scared of her own shadow, living in that shadow. Honestly, I don't even know what you saw in that girl. Selfish, scatterbrained, pathetic. She said the last word so caustically that she almost shook with it, a sour look coming over her face as if loathing for her past self had overwhelmed her. I never thought you were any of those things, John said quietly and looked down. He ran his fork along the rim of his plate, not knowing what to say. He made himself look up. Charlie's face had softened, and now she seemed anxious. But it's still me, she shrugged, her voice breaking. He couldn't answer. He didn't know where to start. Charlie bit her lip. You still think it, don't you? She said after a moment. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat, ashamed, but Charlie pressed on. John, please, I don't understand. If you think I'm not me, then what do you think? What can you possibly think I am? She looked utterly bewildered, and again, John felt himself wavering. I think... He gestured graspingly at the air, catching nothing. Charlie, what I saw! He exclaimed, then stopped short, remembering they were in public. He glanced around, but no one was looking at them. The restaurant was not busy, but everyone there was occupied. The guests talking to the people they came with, the staff talking among themselves. I saw you die, he said, lowering his voice. When you walked into that diner the next day, Charlie, I wanted to believe it was true. I still want to believe it, but I saw you die, he finished helplessly. Charlie shook her head slowly. I'm telling you that I'm alive. How can it not be enough? If you want to believe me, why don't you? The pain in her voice sent a pang of guilt through him, but he met her eyes calmly. Because I'd rather know the truth than believe something just because it would make me happy. Charlie looked at him searchingly. So, what do you think is the truth? Who do you... She swallowed and started again. Who do you think I am, if I'm not me? John sighed. I've thought about it a lot, he said at last. Almost constantly, actually. Charlie nodded slightly, barely moving her head, like she was afraid she would spook him. I thought about a lot of things. I guess theories, like what? Charlie said gently. Well, I should never have agreed to see her. John? I guess maybe I thought you might be Sammy. He mumbled. She looked puzzled for a moment, like she had not quite heard him. Then her eyes widened. Sammy's dead, she said tightly. John looked up at the ceiling and put his hands to his temples. I know, he said, and met her eyes again. But, Charlie, look, I don't know that. Neither do you. The last thing you remember of Sammy, what was it? You know the answer to that, she said in a low, level voice. You saw him being taken, John said after a moment. She had no response, and he took it as license to continue. You saw him being kidnapped, not killed, by Dave or Afton, Springtrap. So, what if he wasn't killed? What if Sammy was raised by William Afton, twisted, and brought up by a murderous madman to replace you, to replace Charlie after her death? Also, Sammy could be short for Samantha. I forgot that part. Sammy could have been a girl all along. Charlie was motionless across the table. She scarcely looked like she was breathing. I know how it sounds when I say it out loud, John added in a rush. That's why I mostly don't. Charlie had covered her face with her hand, and her shoulders were shaking. He broke off as she looked up. This time, she was laughing. There was a manic edge to it, like it might turn back into crying at any moment. But John tentatively tried to smile. Oh, John, she said at last. I don't even... You know that's crazy, right? Is it crazier than anything we've seen? He argued without much conviction. John, you took me to see the grave yourself, remember? John paused and looked confused for a moment, trying to reconcile what he just heard. You took me yourself to Sammy's grave. I took you to the cemetery, but I never saw Sammy's grave. Or your father's, John corrected. Then let's go sometime. Charlie's voice was patient. John felt immediately foolish. Aunt Jen warned me not to come back to Hurricane. Charlie looked down at the table. She's 3 for 3 at this point. Have you heard from her, by the way? From your aunt? John asked, disconcerted by the sudden change of subject. I figured you were living with her after you moved out of Jessica's place. Yeah, Charlie said. You were living with her? Have you seen her? Why would I have seen her? John asked slowly. Why would I have seen her? John asked slowly, suddenly feeling a bit lost in the conversation. He had seen Jen, twice. Once as a child, and once on that terrible night, crouched beside the twisted, broken Freddy suit in a pool of Charlie's blood. But Charlie didn't know about either. You know, I've never actually met her, John said, watching Charlie's face. Her expression was pensive and did not change. I just thought she might try to get in touch, Charlie said idly. Okay, I'll let you know if she does, John offered. Please do. Thanks, Charlie said. It was only then that she seemed to register his confusion. I haven't seen her in a while. She rescued me that night, she said. She took me home and cleaned me up, made sure I was okay. She flashed John a quick half smile, and he returned it warily. I thought you said you didn't remember anything from that night, he said, trying to keep his tone from sounding accusatory. I said there was a lot I don't remember, but mostly that's what Jen told me. Honestly, the first thing I remember is her waking me up the next morning, telling me to put on the dress she had for me. Charlie made a face. She always wanted me to dress more like a girl. Of course, the joke was on me. It turns out after a few near-death experiences, there's nothing I wanted more than a makeover. John smiled as she battered her eyelashes exaggeratedly. He laughed in spite of himself. So, you think she might be looking for you? He paused, unsure how to phrase the next part. Do you want her to find you? He asked at last, and she shrugged. I'd like to know where she is. She's not at the house where you're living? When did she leave? Everybody leaves eventually, Charlie said in a sardonic tone, and he laughed again, less heartedly. You didn't answer my question. Charlie glanced at her watch. Like everything else she now wore, it was a smaller, feminized version of the one she used to have. There's a good zombie movie starting in about 15 minutes, I think, she said brightly. The new theater isn't far from here. What do you think? Should we see if the old formula still works? What does that mean? John held back a smile. I can't go to the movies, he said with real reluctance. I've got somewhere that I need to be. Another time? Charlie said, and he nodded. Yeah, maybe. As he walked back to his car, John noticed a crowd outside the new pizzeria. I guess everybody likes the circus, he thought. He wandered closer, trying to see where Charlie had gone, but she was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, like noticing hidden figures in a picture, John realized that the crowd around him was dotted with clowns, painted faces, wide billowy costumes. Noses of all shapes and colors. They were everywhere. He backed out of the throng, tripping on an oversized shoe and almost falling off the sidewalk. When he was freed of the crowd, John took a deep breath and looked back at the restaurant, noticing for the first time the banner strung over the front entrance. Grand opening, come dressed as a clown and eat free, it read, hanging between the gigantic faces of two grinning clowns. He looked around. More people were arriving, many of them in costume, and John felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced behind him, but there was nothing sinister besides the clowns. He forced himself to look at them individually. People had dressed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some had structured bodysuits, wings, and enormous feet. Others had simply painted their faces and worn polka-dotted t-shirts. Still, his sense of unease did not abate. They're just people in costumes, he scolded himself, then laughed abruptly, startling a woman standing nearby. People in costumes. That's never gone wrong for me, he muttered, walking away from the crowd to find his car. Driving home, John found himself agitated. Twice, he looked at the speedometer and saw that he'd gone dangerously over the speed limit without noticing. He tapped his hand restlessly against the steering wheel, thinking of the next day. Seeing Charlie had rattled him more than he had realized. After months of solitary scribbling, going over and over his bizarre theories, he'd been forced to put his conviction to the test, to ask her questions and watch her answer, and ask himself as he did, are you her? Are you my Charlie? Now that it was over, it felt unreal, like a dream that lingered too long, unwelcome in the waking world. As he approached the turnoff that would take him home, he sped up, driving straight on past it. John parked his car a few blocks away from Clay Burke's house. He pulled the keys out of the ignition and jangled them nervously in his hand for a minute, then opened the door decisively and got out. When he got to the house, it was dark, except for a single window, which he thought was Clay's office. I wonder if Carlton's gone back to school, he wondered, unsure whether he was hoping for his friend's presence or his absence. He knocked and waited, then rang the bell. A long moment later, Clay opened the door. John. Good. he said, and nodded, seeming unsurprised by his presence. He stepped aside to let John in, and ushered him into the study. Do you want some coffee? He asked, gesturing at the mug on his desk. It's a little late for me, John said. I'll be up all night. Clay nodded. I'm substituting lesser vices, was all he said. John glanced around the room. The last time he had been here, they'd used the desk as a barricade against an army of angry animatronics. You fixed the door, he observed. I fixed the door, Clay said. Oak reinforced. What brings you here? I saw Charlie. Clay raised his eyebrows, but didn't say anything. She said something. She asked if I'd heard from... John stopped, seized by a sudden sense that he was being watched. Clay had his head tilted to the side, as though sensing something as well. Silently, Clay made his way to the closed window, positioning himself beside one of the long, pale green drapes, and peered outside. Everyone is a little on edge with all these weirdos walking around in face paint, he said, but he kept his voice low. He pulled the drapes together, then walked back toward John. Have a seat, Clay offered. There were 2 green upholstered chairs and a matching couch along one wall. John sat on the couch. Clay grabbed his desk chair and dragged it across the rug so they were only a few feet apart. What did Charlie ask you? Clay began. John glanced at the window again. He felt as if waves of dread were emanating from it, rolling into the room like an unseen fog. Clay looked back over his shoulder, but only for a second. John cleared his throat. She asked me about Aunt Jen. If I'd seen her. I thought you might know something. He finished uncertainly. Clay looked lost in thought, and John wondered for a moment if he could repeat himself. No, Clay said finally. Did Charlie say why she was asking? John shook his head. She just said she just wanted to know if I'd heard from her. I don't know why I would hear from her, though, he said. He was choosing his words carefully, as if saying the right ones in the right order would unlock a door in Clay's mind and convince him to tell John what he knew. Clay just nodded thoughtfully. Did you ever meet her? John asked. Never a formal introduction, no, Clay said. She was a bit older than Henry, I think. Clay got quiet for a moment and tilted his glass from side to side, swirling the last few sips at the bottom. When he moved here, Henry was something of a recluse. We all knew he'd lost a kid. Clay sat up slowly. Didn't see them for a while, even Charlie, and then... Clay let out a pained sigh. Jen was around for about a year, and she was the one watching the kid. Jen stuck to Charlie's side like glue. I guess Henry didn't trust people anymore, and I can't blame him. I always kind of got the impression... John paused, choosing his words again. Charlie always gave me the impression that she was kind of cold. Well, like I said, after something like that, Clay said. I was surprised when Jen took Charlie after Henry died. He went on. What about Charlie's mother? John asked hesitantly. It felt intrusive to pry. Worse, because Charlie was not here. He felt like they were talking about her behind her back. No. Charlie's mother ran off before her and her father moved to Hurricane, Clay said. Henry never said anything bad about her mother. He pretty much never said anything about her at all. But I asked one day, just out of curiosity. Maybe it was the detective in me. I couldn't help myself. He thought a long time before answering me. Then he gave me this sad look, and he said, she wouldn't know what to do with my little girl. I backed off the subject after that. I mean, I knew they'd lost another kid. I guess I assumed Charlie's mother had had some kind of breakdown, or else just found herself unable to care for a child so much like the one she'd lost. I think it should be said, though, to her Aunt Jen's credit, Charlie seems to have turned out all right. He smiled and gave a nod. She's a bit odd, but she's a good kid. She's unique, for sure, John said. Unique, then? Clay said dryly. The walls trembled briefly as a strong wind passed over the house. John cast his eyes around the room, uncomfortably, then lit on something familiar in the corner, tucked away between the end of a bookshelf and the wall. Is that Ella? John asked, pointing. Clay looked blank for a moment. The doll? That turned up in the rubble of Charlie's old house. The rest got hauled away, but I kept that. Her name is Ella, John said. Charlie's dad made her. She used to go around on the track, carrying a tea set. I asked Charlie if she wanted it, Clay said. She wasn't interested. She wasn't? John repeated, alarmed. Clay shook his head absently. I have a hard time believing that, John said incredulously, as he held the old toy in his arms, and Clay came back to attention. Well, tell her that it's hers, if she ever wants it. I will, John said, setting the doll back down. Clay glanced at the window again, and looked preoccupied. Is something wrong? John asked. Not at all, he said. John raised his eyebrows. Are you sure about that? Clay sighed. A child was abducted this morning. What? A little girl. She disappeared sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. Clay was stone-faced. John searched for words and came up empty. It's the second one this month, Clay added quietly. I haven't heard anything about that, John said. He glanced at the window again as the wind began to howl outside, then looked back at Clay, and immediately the knot of fear took up its post behind his head again. Do you have any leads? John asked the first question he could think of. Clay didn't answer for a long moment, and John asked the next question. Do you think it has something to do with, missing kids? It's not the first time that's happened here. No, it's certainly not. Clay was staring into the space between them, as if there was something there he could see. I don't see any way that it could be connected, though. Freddy's has been destroyed at this point. Right, John said. So, you don't have any leads? I'm doing the best that I can. Clay lowered his head and ran his hand through his hair, then sat up straight again. I'm sorry. It's got me on edge. I feel like I'm reliving those days. Children, the same age as my little boy. The same age as you back when. Getting snatched one after another, and there was nothing I could do to stop it then either. Michael, John said quietly. Michael, and the others. There never seems to be shortage of evil in this world. But that's why we have you, right? John smiled. Clay snorted. Right. I wish it were that simple. You said 2 kids were missing? John said, his eyes drawn again toward the sound of the wind dragging branches and leaves against the side of the house. Clay stood up and went to the window, almost definitely, and opened it wide. John startled at the sound of the wind cracking. John could see from where he sat that Clay seemed to be scanning the area for something under the guise of getting some air. After a moment, he pulled himself back inside and shut the window, then drew the curtains closed. It might not be as bad as it looks now, John. There's usually a normal explanation, and most kids turn up, one way or another. 2 weeks ago, there was a little boy named Edgar, 2.5 years old. What happened? His parents have been fighting about custody for over a year. His father ends up losing that night. Only gets to see the kid once a month. Supervised visits, which I can tell you was for good reasons. Edgar disappears. Surprise, surprise. He was found a few days later, alive and well. Spontaneous road trip with his dad. Most kidnappings, it's one of the parents. Is that what you think is happening here? John asked skeptically. No. Clay didn't take long to answer. No, I don't. He repeated, sounding graver. He took a deep breath and leaned forward. And it doesn't help that the whole town's obsessed with this new restaurant, dressing up like clowns. It's a waste of time for my officers to be doing crowd control, or clown control, as it were. Can I do anything? John asked, though he couldn't imagine what kind of help he could be. Not a thing, Clay said. If I'm right, I may need you, and I'll need... He stopped. Charlie, John said. You'll need Charlie. Clay nodded. It's not fair to ask that of her, Clay said. Not after everything she's been through, but I will if I have to. Yeah, John said. Clay was staring at the space between them again, and John felt suddenly like he was intruding. It's getting late, he said. Yeah, well, watch yourself out there, Clay said, hastily standing. You want to take my gun? Clay said lightly. Don't need it, John grinned. I've got these guns. He held a tight fist in the air and threatened the room before letting himself out. Okay, tough guy. See you soon, Clay said grimly. John started back toward his car. It was pitch black now. It had been dark when he arrived. He realized, but now he noticed it. The street lamps didn't go far. The pools of light beneath him swallowed up only a few feet out. His footsteps landed hard, and there seemed to be no way to quiet them. The distant roar of the highway was too faint to provide cover, and the wind was silent for the time being, as though it had temporarily gone into hiding. Something moved a few yards ahead of him, and John stopped dead. Coming down the road was another costumed moviegoer, but there was something off about this one. It was heading in his direction, walking in the middle of the road at an even pace. John stayed where he was between two of the tall, thin saplings planted along the sidewalk, his eyes glued to the approaching figure. As it came closer, a chill gripped John's spine. The clown's movements were feminine, but wrong. She walked like something mechanical, yet graceful. His breath caught in his throat as the clown glided toward him like a wraith. The creature was staring straight ahead as it passed. John waited, hoping to stay out of its line of sight. As she grew closer, however, her eyes drifted toward him, her head turning only slightly as though to acknowledge his passing. John stared back, at first admiring the sleek and controlled beauty of her face, split down the middle through some trick of costuming. John instinctively took a step back. He had seen monsters before, and prepared to run, or fight if necessary. But just as his heart began thudding against his chest, she looked away again and slipped back into the dark, as gracefully as she had appeared. John watched for a moment, then continued to his car. He checked his rearview mirror, but there was no one in sight. As he drove home, he checked the mirror more often than he needed to. His thoughts kept returning to those shiny, penetrating eyes. The clown had looked at him like she knew him, like she could see right through him. Relax, John said to the empty car. It was just some weirdo in a costume. Saying the words aloud, however, did not make them any more convincing. Clay went back to his office and stopped by the window, drawing aside the curtain slightly to make sure John had made it around the corner and out of sight. Clay sighed. He sat down at his desk, picked up the case files on the second missing child, and began to review it. The information he needed just wasn't there, but it didn't stop him from returning to it over and over again. His officers had diligently done their jobs. They'd gone to the right places, talked to the right people, and asked all the wrong questions. They just don't know what I know. There was a sound from down the hallway, a distinct creak. Clay's eyes lifted, and he set the file carefully back on his desk. John? He called, but there was no response. With practiced calm, Clay quietly reached for the gun he kept in a holster under his desk and flipped the safety on. He went to the open office door and paused, listening for another noise from the dark hall. Nothing came. Clay pulled the door shut, snapping the deadbolts into place. Clay stepped back into the center of the room and stood, listening. A moment passed in silence, and his eyes dropped, his shoulders feeling at ease. But suddenly, his eyes lifted again, and his jaw clenched. He took one deliberate step back, focusing directly on the center of the door ahead of him. He lifted and steadied his gun, and took aim. Several minutes passed, but Clay's eyes never wavered. There was something in the hall. John let his front door fall shut behind him with a heavy thud and tossed his keys on the kitchen counter. He sat down heavily on the couch, letting his head fall back, weighted down with fatigue. After only a moment, he lifted his head back up. The strange noise was coming from his bedroom again. It sounded a little like the sound the rabbit's head had been making, but something had changed, though he couldn't pinpoint how. It sounded like a voice, then static. A voice, then static. Something was being repeated. John's bedroom door was almost all the way closed, and he got up from the couch and approached it slowly from the side, putting his feet down silently one after the other, the rubber sole scarcely tapping the floor. He eased the door open. The sound was louder now, more distinct. The voice continued, garbled and muffled. John turned on the light and went to Theodore's head. He bent over so his eyes were level with Theodore's plastic ones, and listened. The rabbit's head stared back, muttered words, broke into static, then a moment later repeated. John grabbed a notebook and pen off his bed and closed his eyes, concentrated on the sounds. After a minute, he began to hear words. Shining? John whispered. Shining. Something. Silver? He continued to listen, but he couldn't make out the rest. John gritted his teeth and opened his eyes, glaring at the stuffed rabbit's head as it continued to repeat the same incoherent phrase. John drew in a long breath, then let it out, trying to release the tension in his neck, in his jaw, in his back. He sat down on the bed, put the pen and paper down, and closed his eyes once more. Just listen. The sounds repeated, again and again. Suddenly, they resolved, like song lyrics after the 1,000th play. John understood. Shining star? Silver. Something. Silver reef? Shining star. Silver reef. Shining star. Silver reef. Theodore repeated. John got up again, putting his ear to Theodore's nose, trying to make sure he had it right. Shining star. Silver reef. The rabbit intoned. John raced back to his car. When he reached Clay's driveway again, John stopped dead. The front door was gaping open, light from inside the house, spilling into the yard. He ran up the steps, calling, Clay! Clay, are you here? He ran inside, still shouting, and made for Clay's office just a few steps past the front hall. Clay! John dropped to his knees beside Clay. He was on the floor, one side of his face slick with his own blood, more pooling beneath his head. His eyes were closed. John grabbed his wrist and pressed his fingers against the veins, hoping for a pulse. After a few frantic seconds, he found it, and relief washed through him, but it was momentary. Clay? John repeated, jostling him lightly. Clay didn't respond. John looked around with alarm. The new door, the one Clay had described as reinforced, was in pieces. What was left of the door was still hanging in place by the upper hinge. Hastily, John pulled Clay out into the hall as best as he could. He glanced back toward the office. The chair was overturned, and everything that had been on the desk littered the carpet. He patted Clay's shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said hoarsely, and he went to the office phone and dialed 911. As he waited for an operator, he looked nervously back at the demolished door. Another surge of wind rushed through the front door and out the open window, seemingly to carry with it whatever horror had happened here.